And we're finishing up our series on Who Are You? Who are you? And the question is, are you a burden bearer? Are you a burden bearer? And today we're going to, you can see we're going to have several scriptures we're going to talk about, but we'll target a few that will stand out as we go. What does it mean to be a burden bearer of one another's burdens? What does it mean to bear one another's burdens? I mean, why should we do that? I mean, besides the fact that it says in the Word, we're told to do that. Let me share a story with you of a preacher that was trying to reach out to his community. His idea was to get people from the church to go and work at the local grocery stores and laundromats, and they would just help folks. So he phoned several of these stores and wanted to get permission for him to bring his team down there, and so he'd make plans and plan ahead. And on one call, the employee answered the phone and hesitated just for a minute and said, I probably should ask the manager about this, right? I probably should check in on this. But first, let me make sure I understand what you're wanting to do. So you want to clean up the parking lot, retrieve all the shopping carts, hold umbrellas for customers, and you don't want anything in return. And the preacher said, yeah, that's right. That's what we want to do. The employee set the phone down and he went to talk to the manager. When he came back to the phone, he said, I'm sorry, but we can't let you do that. If we let you do that, then we got to let everyone else do it too. Strange, isn't it? How society is. I mean, really, why would the store not let him help folks? I mean, I can think of several reasons. You're probably thinking of some right now yourself. I mean, the fact is, maybe there's a little bit of a suspicion. It's kind of suspicious that folks want to do something and not get paid. But what caught my attention about this story was the comment by the employee, let me make sure I understand. Clean up the parking lot, retrieve the shopping carts, hold umbrellas for customers, and you don't want anything in return. We've been taught growing up, there's no free meals, right? Nothing in life is free except Jesus. We've been put in our head. And I think maybe the store turned down the church because they suspected some ulterior motive. And of course, if it was happening today, this happened back in the day when it wasn't, but if it's happening today, it'd be like, oh, you're trying to brainwash my customers, right? It's ironic that people think that way, but that's really what happens. And the fact is that we live in a world where there's a lot of people out there that tend to have ulterior motives. There are people that want to get into a place for a certain reason. And a lot of folks seem to live their lives based on their own self-interest. I mean, if you think about it, this is a good time to look at that because it's an election year, right? Listen to all the promises that these people make. And then go back and look at their history and compare it to the promises and see what has changed. You know what's changed? It's election year. And people change because they know they need to say certain things to try to get you to vote for them. But you see, that is basically lying, isn't it? I mean, unless there's been a true heart change and you see the fruit. But to have someone all of a sudden change. So when you vet someone, when you look at people to vote for, look at not just what they're saying today, look to see if it matches up with their lifestyle, the things they said in the past. Because that makes a difference. And there's a lot of folks that's going to say whatever they need to say to get your vote, to promote their self-interest. I mean, let's play a little mind game together. Let's say that you inherited $1 million. What would you do with that kind of money? I mean, think about it just a few minutes. What would you do if you inherited $1 million? Some folks would probably say, well, I'm going to pay off all my bills. But $1 million, you probably don't have $1 million in debt. Come on. We know each other, and ain't nobody got no $1 million in debt. So there's going to be money left. I mean, when you think about it, some people say, I'd buy me a new house, I'd buy a new car, I'd invest in business, I'd start one of them IRA money accounts, even give some money to the relatives. And you'll be surprised how many relatives you have at that point. They come out of the woodwork and they remember me, I'm Cousin Zeke. Right? You know what I'm talking about. But the fact is that what would you do if you inherited that? And just remember, it's just a game. We're just pretending. Money doesn't exist. It's all pretend, in this situation. So let me ask you this, and don't raise your hand, but how many of you thought about giving a percentage of the money to the church? Giving 10% right off the top of what was given to you. A portion of the inheritance to the poor, maybe, or to a mission. How many have thought about those things? And some of you may have thought about it, about giving some of the money away, about sharing with others, about supporting your favorite nonprofit. But there's a lot of people who wouldn't have thought that, who would think about giving some of the money away. Sometimes it's an afterthought. There's a show that came out back in probably the 70s or 80s, and where a policeman that was married to a lady, and he was a beat cop, and he was eating lunch with his partner, and his partner had to go out, and he had just enough money to cover the bill, but not for the tip. And he told her, he said, listen, he said, I'm going to do you a favor. I'm going to come back here. He said, I've got this lottery ticket I bought, and I'm going to come back here tomorrow. If I win the lottery, then I'm going to give you half of it. If I don't, I'm just going to double the tip I was going to give you. He said, does that sound fair? She said, oh, sure. Because he's probably heard that 100 times. And so, ironically, he won the lottery. Now, his wife was very excited about it. And now he had the odious task of telling her that I promised to give half of it to this waitress. And she said, she wasn't on to that. She thought, no. She said, what about us? What about me? And it was like $6 million. $6 million. He said, we can get by on $3 million, I think. Right? And so at first he let her persuade him, but when he got to the place where she's working, and he had a little packet of money he was going to give to her to double the tip, then he saw how she was working with the people and talking to the people and loving people, and he said, I got to do what's right. And he decided just to tell her, hey, we won. And so it was really a great story because it shows a person that has money in his face and does right by it. He stands by his word. And then it shows his wife, who was all about his wife, period. And if you watch the show, I forget the name of it, but it's got Nicolas Cage in it, I think. But if you watch the show, it really shows the dual sides. And that's what we're talking about, is who we are. And he basically, the thing I remembered, because we're talking about being a burden bearer, he said that if he didn't do what was right, he couldn't live with himself, right? I mean, do we ever get to that place where we know what to do is right and we don't choose to do it because of the impact to ourselves or to our family or to our situation or to our job? I remember one time where I had to stand up at my job and say I'm not going to do something that they wanted me to do because it was wrong. You've got to make choices. And I ended up leaving that job that week, the next day. And so you've got to make choices in life. and realize that, your choices is something you live with all your life until you stand before Jesus. But the point is it's not to make anyone feel bad about their choices or about how they spend inheritance or whatever, but the point is really to think about others before we think about ourselves. We learn as kids that it's kind of hard to share. But it's ironic when you see, like, I don't know if you ever watched, the kids say the darndest things. If you ever watched that, where you put kids in situations and sometimes they surprise you. Sometimes they will share without being prompted. But other times they're like us. They don't want to share. They don't want to do it. And that's where we learn from. But the fact is that it's almost natural for most people to think in that frame of mind. And I think that's why Jesus told us in Luke 9:23, he said, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. You've got to deny yourself in order to follow Christ. Because, we know you can't serve two masters. You've got to deny yourself. And that's why I think Paul, when he wrote in Philippians, he gave us this thought. Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, he said, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look at not only to his own interest, but also to the interest of others. And that brings us to the text we're going to talk about today. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 2. Turn over there and let's read it together. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 2. This is where Paul is talking to the Galatian church and to us as well today. And he gives us this narrative that we have a responsibility. So let's read this together. Galatians 6, verse 2. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. May God honor the reading of his word. This is significant in the fact that, what does it mean to us? Once we become Christians, part of being a grown-up believer is learning to put others before yourself and to bear their burdens, to share the responsibility, to help them. You remember when Moses was up on the rock and they were crossing the Red River, and he was up on the rock and the staff was extended, which was holding the water back, the power of God, and that was the symbol of it. Aaron had to get up next to him and help him hold that staff because his arms, Have you ever tried to hold something up in the air, a stick or something up in the air, and it's like you start shaking, your knees get a little wiggly, It's hard. Because you think it's easy, but get on a ladder and try it. You probably know. Get on a ladder and try it. Your arms get a little shaky. Even Moses needed his brother to get up there and hold it, brother-in-law. Get up there and hold it to help him hold that staff. We need burden bearers in our lives, and more importantly, we need to be a burden bearer. We need to be there, Paul had Timothy. Everyone, if you look back through the time, you look through Scripture, you see where someone was there, right? John and Peter hung out. There's people that linked together and helped one another. But we have to bear one another's burdens. And that's hard sometimes. Putting others ahead of ourselves, is that most folks don't do that today. And we use the frame of mind, well, maybe they don't deserve that kind of treatment. A lot of folks tend to annoy us. Am I right? A lot of folks tend to annoy us, and they disappoint us, and they fall short of our expectations, and they confound us sometimes. we might even have treated us badly a time or two. And we're told we're supposed to bear their burdens? There was a German philosopher, I won't even try to say his name, but it sounds like this: Schopenhauer. Good luck with that. But he compared the human race to a bunch of porcupines huddled together on a cold winter's night. He said, the colder it gets outside, the more we huddle together for warmth. But the closer we get to one another, the more we hurt one another with our sharp quills. And in the lonely, cold night of Earth's winter, eventually we begin to drift apart and wander out on our own and freeze to death in our loneliness. It's a strange thought, isn't it? It's cozy. That's a cozy thought, isn't it, for today? Apparently there was a kind of atmosphere that existed in the Galatian church that had this kind of realm to it. In verse 15, chapter 5, verse 15, Paul warned them. He said, if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you're not consumed by one another. That's a strange thing to say, isn't it? If you bite and devour one another, I guess that's where the term backbite comes from. If you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another. And then in jump to verse 26 of chapter 5, he says, let us not become conceited, provoking one another, envying one another. You see, because that's what leads to these problems. When you're conceited, who are you thinking about? Help me out. Yourself. You're thinking about yourself. When you provoke one another, what are you doing? It's like poking a bear, isn't it? You're trying to push buttons, is what we call it today, I guess. And then when it says not to envy one another, right? That's where you want what somebody else has, which means you're not happy with what God has given you. You see, it's important that Paul comes from, if you bite one another, devour one another, and then he goes into this idea that, you know, it's because you're conceited, you're provoking, and you're envying one another. In the next verse, he says, brothers, if anyone is caught up in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. And keep watch on yourself, lest you also be tempted. That's a good scripture. Because he's saying that if anyone is caught up in any transgression, that's pretty open, isn't it? Anyone caught up in any transgression, you who are spiritual, now he's making a point to say, are you spiritual? That's what he's really asking. Are you spiritual? You who are spiritual should restore him in the spirit of gentleness. In churches today, someone said that the church is the only one that shoots their wounded. You ever heard that statement? I might have made it up. But the fact is, no, I heard it really. But the fact is that, in other words, what he's saying is that sometimes the church gets so caught up in themselves and in the positions and in the idea of church that they don't realize that they're there. We're a hospital, right? We're not a society club. We're not the Lions Club or something. We are a hospital for wayward sinners, for people that are hurting. Because why? Because that's who we are too, right? We're all at different stages in our walk with Christ. We're all at different places. That's who we are. And so when do we come to a place where when someone transgression happens, when they're caught up in something, that we push them out because they don't fit in anymore, instead of loving them in and restoring them, bringing them back? Because that's what we're called to do. And it's important that we realize that we, a church, we're a society of sinners. We are a society of sinners. We all have our own sharp quills that can hurt others, that we don't share with anybody. And that means that when conflicts arise, some of us have got to be grown-ups. We've got to restore other people into the fellowship. And in the spirit of gentleness, we need to do it. But if we don't, it proves that perhaps we don't understand what it truly means to be spiritual. Are we living that life? Are we bearing the fruit of the life that God has put us in? Because that tells the story. Back to the politicians, it's not what they say, it's what they do. It's what they stand for. And that's the story of a Christian. It's not what you say. I don't care if you quote Scripture day and night. If you don't live it, if you don't see it in your life, you need to rethink it. You need to make sure you understand what it means to be born again, what it means to be a Christian. Years ago, I heard a man tell about a revival he did in the church. And a few members wanted to talk to him privately after the first service. So they met in the classroom, and when they got there, the revivalists found that they wanted to unload on him about the shortcomings of their preacher, of their pastor. They wanted him to confirm that they had every right to run this preacher off. And the revivalist, he paused for a minute and he asked, he said, "Who's the leader of our group here?" And a man toward the back said, "I am." And then the revivalist observed, and he said, "I expect that you've gathered because you are a group of spiritual people who are concerned about your preacher's many faults as you've shared them." In response, the group again began to list the series of their small complaints, which taken together mounted up to an insurmountable challenge before them. The revivalist paused again and said, "Well, since you are spiritual people, the scripture in Galatians 6 should be your guide. Brothers, if anyone is caught up in any transgression," that means the preacher too, "you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you also be tempted." So the leader of the group practically sprang up out of his chair and he says, "I'm not about to restore that preacher." And he stormed out of the room. Now, does that shock anybody? Not if you've been in a Baptist church for a while. I've heard all kinds of things. I've been in a sound booth and had a couple of deacons in front of the sound booth talking about getting rid of the preacher. I was the preacher. That's how people are sometimes. And what did I do? What do you think I did? I walked out of the sound booth and said, "Hey, morning, fellas. Good to see you." The fact is that people are that way. People are that way. And here, he's in that situation. But that's just what some of the members, that church, what they did to their preacher. But it can also happen between church members. It's a mentality of the person, whoever it is. And it really isn't worthy of your time or of your love. It's a mentality that where people decide they give up on someone. But Jesus, when he talks about forgiveness, does he say forgive and then give up? No, he says forgive 70 times 7. You need to always be forgiving. You need to always be open to share that love of Christ and bringing people back into the fold. You can't shun people and push them away, have nothing to do with them. You've got to love them. Even if they choose to walk away in their sin, you still love them. You still check on them. Until they tell you, "Quit calling me," then you continue to pray for them. And it happens, I know, because I've talked to people that way. The fact is that we need to be those people that bear one another's burdens. You and I have got to be careful about that. Because if we get to the point where we write people off and we shun them, we talk about them behind their backs, because we don't gossip in the church, you know that. I had a lady just the other day say, I wouldn't say nothing about so-and-so unless it was good. Boy, is this good. And then they shared a little something they shouldn't have. Fact is that sometimes it's easy to fall into that trap. But we've got to be beyond that. We've got to be beyond that. How do I know if we're not following Jesus? How do I know? You remember the story about the night that Jesus was betrayed? He gathered his disciples in the upper room for the Last Supper. And Jesus left the room and came back carrying a bowl of water and a towel. And he wrapped it around his waist. If you remember what Jesus did next, he washed his disciples' feet. Right? He washed his disciples' feet. He washed all of his disciples' feet. And why is that important? You need to realize Judas had not left the room yet. Right? Now, who's Judas? What did Judas do afterwards? Right? He gave him up, didn't he? He betrayed him. But at that moment, and Jesus already knew he was going to do it. He even told him, he said, go do what you need to do, right? He knew he was going to betray him, but he washed his feet. That tells us something, doesn't it? We might know that somebody might, but the fact is you still love them. You still accept them. You still wash their feet. You still be the person that is beyond that. You still care for them. If you've dealt with anyone with addiction, you love them. You stand by them. You can't change them. God can change them. You pray for them. But you're there for them. And they might let you down, but they might get their 30-year chip. You know what I mean? I know both sides of it. I've been on both sides of it. And so we need to make sure that we're those people, that we're the ones that are standing. We're the ones that understand. We're the ones that accept people where they are and love them. For the most part, I'm probably preaching to the choir here. This church is very welcoming and loving to people. And every once in a while, we all need to be reminded of this truth we're talking about today. But let's switch gears for a minute and talk about how we can bear one another's burdens. When it says bear one another's burdens, it's not just talking about the lost, it's talking about each other, talking about the saints. And Paul puts it this way, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are of the household of faith. Galatians 6:10. So you hear what he's saying? Let us do good to everyone, but especially to those of the household of faith. That's weans right there. That's us. Let us do good to everyone. It can only apply to a number of good things we can do. Prayer for people's needs, encouraging folks who are struggling, giving someone a ride, talking to them about God, sharing some food with them. Maybe they need some food this month, this week. Just talking to folks, just being there. Whether it's physical or financial, whatever it is, just be there. As a church tries very hard to put the principle into practice, to help people in the community with their needs, if someone calls and asks for help with something, we try to help them, we try to meet that need, but many times their request is far more than we can do as a small church. And so I've got a a book where I have I call it the care book, and it's got a listing of all the agencies and all the bigger churches around, so that I can send them to someone that can help them, if we can. But I always tell them we love them, and we'd love to see them here. And I do tell them that if we, are members of our church, if they have a need, we will step up as a church to take care of our family. And I ask them, do you have a family like that? And I always invite them to come and become part of our family. And so it's important to us to not just have a no, but to have an answer. Have an answer. I've talked to other pastors as I was preparing this sermon about how much more in these days we see people with needs. And most of them said if we have the funds, we help out just like we would. And if unable to connect with them, they do what I do. They place them in a situation where they can reach out to someone. But one said, and most agreed, that we should always ask if they attend church. And that's something that I always do. And I always share with them how the church helps one another as well. And if you're a member, if you're a part of the body, then we are burden bearers. And that's what he's talking about. It brings us back to the scripture, that we bear one another's burdens and we help one another out. If you remember, in last several years here, I know that as a church, we've helped members with bills and gas and food and things like that. But we've seen people that get back on their feet, and we've seen people just go away and move on down the road. But we had one man, that was a guy that was touched by the things we did, and he's never attended a service, but he was touched by one of our members, and he built that lighthouse back there. That's on the deal. And that's what he does. He builds those models. And he, asked us if he could bring it by. And I said, please. Because he was touched by one of our members and how he helped them. And that says a lot for our church. Because our church is us. It's who we are. And we can't grow weary of doing good. We can't stop doing the things that make us who we are. Sometimes folks just help others because it makes them feel warm and fuzzy. But the fact is that we need to give to others and offer ourselves and let God have His way in their life. There's others who think that the government ought to take care of everybody when they realize that the government has no money except what we give them. We call that socialism. Now, you're saying, Brother Dave, you're getting off the track. No, I'm not. I'm not getting off the track. I just want you to